Stop me if you've heard this before. A son of a god is born and bred for violence, taught to kill, taught to wage war, a destroyer. Raised in a loveless environment, emotionally and mentally controlled by rage, only satiated by the death of perceived and real enemies. Manipulated by his own kin, but nonetheless responsible for his actions, resulting in the death of his family. He grows up to commit some casual war crimes, including the uncountable deaths of innocent souls in an attempt to fill a hole inside that could never be filled. Resigned to literal self-loathing and only partially metaphorical self-flagellation, it's only through the love and trust of a wife and child, along with an earnest look at himself in the mirror, that he sees another path, a chance to be better, for the sake of his family.
You're just like me for real.
So, my kings, queens, and themperors, let's talk about it. I'm Dennis from Nuts for the Birds, and this is one about grief and guilt and God of War. To state the obvious, there are at least a few parallels between Thor and Kratos, which makes his path so interesting. He is, unambiguously, what Kratos could have become had Zeus got his hooks in him from the beginning, and molded him into a weapon of the gods and not against them. He's a lot like a war veteran with PTSD. Staving off the horrors of his actions, he seeks refuge in drink and destruction. He's been abused, molded into a killer, been made to feel pride over it, and uses his actions to seek validation, as that's probably the only praise he ever got from Odin. And even then, it may be just the only way to have avoided abuse. Odin himself tells Atreus in no uncertain terms that he feels the only way to teach him is through persistent denigration, that treating him like shit is how he learns, through abuse. Unable to process his actions, he retreats to drink and destruction. His guilt and grief are intrinsically tied to each other, feeding each other. If Kratos hadn't grown during Ragnarok, there's no way Thor would have seen reason in the end. And it's only because Kratos was so fucked up, his actions so seemingly irredeemable, that Thor could even be reached. He could see a version of himself that fosters the belief that he can meaningfully change.
Don't you know what I've done? Yes! But what will you do now?
Through that persistent love and acceptance of his wife Sif and daughter Thrud, he can find a way out. But he rejects their attempts to reach him because, as Kratos said before,
it is difficult to seek forgiveness when you feel unworthy.
Odin made sure that Thor felt unworthy for anything but death. And sadly, he only recognized it at the very end. Because remember, Odin is a top-tier piece of shit. Top tier. You get it? Much has been said about Odin's role in Ragnarok, from the incredibly smarmy performance to his tension-filled interactions where people know a liar is cooking but still can't smell the dish, to his ultimate deception being revealed in a culmination of his attempts to subjugate the people he has no control over. His skill at manipulation can't be understated. He tricked Mimir and Kratos into thinking he didn't want them to look for Tyr, all to insert himself as a spy in a camp he couldn't penetrate, getting Atreus to complete a task he couldn't do, and gathering info about his enemies and his perceived destiny every step of the way. But when we discuss his guilt and grief, it's important to highlight the lack of it. Maybe some subtle hints for small, genuine moments that he may have actually had that led him to where he is. When we talk about portrayals of grief, it's easy to focus on the realistic expressions of sorrow, frustration, and anger. But the fact is, some people are compassionless or detached in the face of death. One of the most telling aspects of Odin's personality is in the very beginning. His callous acknowledgement over the deaths of his son and grandson. He spits on their memories, complains about Thor's grief, tries to get him to drink and break his own vows to his family, calls his son Balder a tracker. It's a very explicit way of detached, possessive feelings over these things. They are things to him, not people. Clearly, he only longs for the control he had, objectifying Thor as a tool of power. He is constantly shitting on Thor, pushing him to drink, deriding him for trying to be sober, constantly reaffirming his worst traits and shutting down his attempts to think or grow beyond his current role. In here, though, is the kernel of a why. Why be so heavy-handed with Thor, and so cozy with Atreus, and so detached with Balder? Well, it's easy to say that he understands people. He can tell when certain people need certain kinds of manipulation, sometimes a soft touch, sometimes a hard hand. But obviously, he doesn't know people as well as he thinks he does, or rather, he doesn't care about what they need, only what his best path to manipulating them is. In Thor, though, there's an interesting change. Specifically, Thor's mom was a giant, and apparently Odin genuinely felt love for his partner, but she died, and he was left with his son, a son that clearly he had no interest in relating to. Instead, he used Thor as an outlet for processing a potentially shattering feeling that he'd rather have had his son die instead. He's unable to recognize his own place in the perpetuation of this cycle of abuse, to the point where in his final moments, he still refuses responsibility for his family's destruction, becoming an Eric Andre meme of himself. "Why would you do this?" he says. Oh my god, dude, what a shithead. I fucking hate this guy. And while he puts on a show that
dying is what we Aesir live for,
he's just using other people as a shield to avoid his own passing. First, Freya received some of the worst of it, then Magni, Modi, Balder, and Heimdall were all sacrificed for it, and ultimately, the Midgardians and Thor himself become tragic victims to it. Odin uses people, and when he couldn't use anyone else up, he was the only one left. A reminder that when we climb over each other, we're just pushing each other down. The few people that escape his wake become irrevocably damaged as a result. Freya has easily one of the most heartbreaking stories in this world's mythology. Once again, due to a combination of external forces and self-inflicted trauma, when told of Balder's needless death, she worked to avert it instead of focusing on the time they have left being meaningful, which all led to the spell placed upon him that would make him
invulnerable to all threats.
Physical or magical.
Aye.
In the Norse legends, we learn that Balder, the Beautiful, is a child of light whom the entire world would love. The gods respected him, the people worshipped him, the other realms idolized him. In those legends, it paints a rosy picture of enjoyment and entertainment at the fantastical result of weapons bouncing off his body or curving out of the way, until the festivities are cut short by the mischievous and envious Loki of the Jotnar. Like in the myths, mistletoe breaks his curse and leads to his prophesied death made certain by the consistently bad decisions of the people involved. What we see in the games that the myths could never capture in the sparse offerings of the Poetic Edda by top-tier author named Snorri Sturluson is just how damaging this fate would be on a long enough timeline. I can imagine a younger Balder, newly made invincible, appreciative and elated at the actions of his mother, who feels like she's genuinely done a great thing, saved her boy from feeling the pain and cruelty of this world. But what is cruelty if not a lack of feeling? Over time, that emptiness ate away at his mind. Food would lose its taste, the sun its warmth, the breeze its soft, fleeting chill, until only the sensation of a persistent buzzing in his own mind was left. A yearning to feel literally anything at all. Pain, pleasure, fear. An itch that can't be scratched. And what's left when the inevitable occurs? When the unstoppable force meets the invulnerable object? Well, sadly, something had to give, and in the end, it was Balder. So Freya committed to self-sacrifice, whether as a genuine motherly decision or an extension of her guilt and wish for release from a living grief that has taken everything from her. Odin took her boy. He did what he does best. But grief can be a black bag brought over our eyes, swallowing up any light and leaving us directionless. She had hoped to gain forgiveness in her death, and instead, she was denied the easy route out. So she turned to her grief, left unresolved, and pointed it at Kratos. If Baldur was an arrow, a tool to be pointed in that direction and fired, Kratos became the shield that it would crash and break against. Ultimately, though, Odin holds the bow, and it's only through a genuine connection between Freya and Kratos that the common ground could be reached. To say Kratos understands family drama is putting it mildly. He confesses openly and honestly, discussing the people he has left in his wake. His brother, captured and tortured as a result of the prophecy that set the wheels of destruction in motion. His wife Lysandra and his daughter Calliope, victims of the god Ares' actions, but ultimately only able to stand to be used against him because of his choices. Had he turned away from war and needless conquest even back then, things would have been different. But we know that changes don't come easy. The deaths of those responsible and the collateral damage incurred along the way all etched into his memory, as real as the ash on his skin. So when Freya goes from ally to enemy, the path back feels hopeless, but begrudging acceptance fighting a common enemy provides a natural jumping off point back to forgiveness and love for found family. During her incredible journey in Freya's Peace, we see her break the ties to her past, which provides no comfort. No physical item could manage this. It isn't a cup or a crown that shackles her. The grief can't be stuffed into an object and burned away. It comes through self-reflection, recontextualizing what people take from us and what we can reclaim for ourselves. She learns to accept the pieces left behind and is able to decide to forge a new path forward as the new person that she is. Her connection with Freyr is the exact same. She broke ties with him, unwilling to accept his cruel final words. Had she come back and reconciled with Freyr earlier, he very well may have been able to help her solve the problem Kratos would in Ragnarok, to remove the chains binding her to Midgard. But it was a battle she wasn't ready to fight. I really like Freyr, who gets his own little moments in this game to shine. His grief and regret over the time lost with his sister leads him to finally step up in the end, and with a real sense of self-sacrifice, he goes to show how powerful reconciliation can be. He was characterized as being a party boy who would never take on the work when needed, and unless the work was a party with friends, he wasn't into it. He goes on to understand the weight of sacrifice and meet the challenge head-on to give his family and the realms another chance forward. But not everyone signs up for sacrifice. On replay, every scene with Sindri hits different. It's amazing how many little moments went unnoticed for me the first time. He said all he felt like we did was take, and that's just a projection of his grief and trauma. We did take, but we took what was offered and given, but some was also taken for granted. When Atreus brings home Tyr and says, "We offered him a place to stay," Sindri says, "Of course you did." And then he lets him in anyway. When we throw a snowball at him, we know deep down that he doesn't think it's funny or enjoyable, but we just do it anyway. Whenever Kratos interacts with him, he grunts and mutters his disapproving way, even when given tools to progress through the world. I don't expect stimulating conversation from Grumbles most of the time, but still, it's noticeable. When Atreus apologizes for hitting him as a bear, he doesn't quite forgive him because he isn't ready, and that chance to do so never quite comes. I feel the depth of his anger and frustration, but ultimately it's self-loathing. It's deep down understanding that he wasted years of time with his brother in a fight that shouldn't have happened. That ultimately it's his selfishness and inability to accept the past that dooms Brock to eternal nothingness without his soul bits. Had he accepted his passing the first time, he would move on to a new existence, but because of his actions, because of his choices, that's not possible. And he knows this, but he's not ready for that part of this problem yet. It's a masterful arc. It's tragic and powerful. It's important to show that while all these other relationships are healed and growing, some of them may irreparably break, and only time can tell if these wounds heal or fester. It's only because of Atreus and Kratos that he's back with his brother. But that means very little when your family is gone, even if Atreus and Kratos viewed him as families too. His change from neat freak to grimy goblin is completely stunning. The knowledge that he was probably only made a neat freak because of the traumatizing experience of being gripped by the souls of the dead as he hunted down his brother's soul bits in the Lake of Alfheim makes it all the more disheartening. He might never have been this way had he accepted way back then the finality of his brother's death. It's that inability to accept, though, that punctuates his biggest flaw in his character. He knows this. He even states it to Atreus. He made a choice that wasn't his to make. To keep death from the ones he loves, and now, the ultimate culmination of that love is his grief. And while he couldn't and wouldn't accept it, some do, and find peace through that process of acceptance. What is abundantly clear by the end of Ragnarok is that much of what we know about Atreus we can link back to Faye. Because if Atreus is a trickster, Faye is a downright compassionate master of mischief. Seeing the future through her own visions and the many around her, she decided early on that fate is what you make it. She knows this implicitly, and she staked her life on it. One neat detail in 2018 is when we go to the lake, it is never commented on, but it's her yellow paint splashed across Tyr's chest, advising them to offer their weapons to the Jormungandr serpent, which imbues it with Aedir poison that made the battle wounding Thor possible. It's her actions keeping them hidden and then using her death as the catalyst to break that protection, which spurs them forward. Kratos drops several inferences at how frustrated and confused he is over her choices to keep secrets, viewing his secrets as different. He commented once that her past is hers, but clearly he wishes, he understands, he simultaneously knows, showing that while he views her past life as hers, he also understands that things could have been different. He could have learned more. He could have asked and opened his heart to her past and let her see his. She fought cruel gods, became a rebel leader, fiercely defended her people, and saw hope in the hopeless. She would have been an ideal god to emulate, had she been one, and how fitting that the ideal god is just a person, with a firm grasp on the value of mortality and an open heart for the struggles of others. Her final promise with Kratos is stuck with me.
You feel your absence.
Culmination of love is grief. And yet we love, despite the inevitable. We open our hearts to it. To grieve deeply is to have loved fully. Open your heart to the world as you have opened it to me, and you will find every reason to keep living in it.
I love this. In many ways, it's just so tragically true. Whether it's a pet or a friend, a family member, or even nostalgia for that which we hold dearest, we venture into every relationship with the implicit truth that it will end, platonic, romantic. It doesn't matter. Whether we are around for it or not, grief will be left behind. But love and grief are not there to cancel each other out. Love does not fly off to make space for grief. They coexist as a complex set of feelings that rely on each other to reach the highest point of themselves. Grief is a natural part of love on a long enough timeline, and she doesn't shy away from that. In fact, if anything, she's been learning to accept that grief she knows for a fact will be left behind. She's already experiencing the grief of losing them in her own way. She truly believes that love, despite all the pain that it will inevitably bring, is worth the cost, and that opening your heart to the world will see you filled. That was her request to a man defined by grief, left behind when rage burns everything else away. There's an important moment in 2018. Exploring Tyr's temple, Kratos finds maybe the last piece of his homeland, a bottle of Lemnian wine, which he savors with his son. The expressions on his face, the acting, the music, it all says more than any dialogue could. He laments the passing of his home. He may be internally reflecting on why that place doesn't exist anymore, what it meant to him, and ultimately shares what he can with Atreus. And then he tells his son that he only killed people who deserved it. And while Zeus was surely deserving, most of the people dead in his wake were not. Whether due to guilt or some other force, he at that point still could not be open and honest about the reality of his decision. Kratos did not really deal with his grief, the persistent familial loss he suffered. He got revenge, just like Sindri, their tasks completed, but there's no peace and just a mountain of regrets. And with nothing left to point their rage at, what would they do but wander, haunted by the memories and physical reminders bound to them in every sense? When Kratos does finally deal with his grief, he accepts his pain. He grows closer to his son. He saves the realms. Literally, the entire world falls into the place that it should be in the path of someone who finally cares for the world he exists in for its own sake and not for his. Not as an inconvenience or an indulgence, but as an implicit good to be experienced and helped to flourish. Kratos is certainly not immune to his own bad decisions, though. While he accepts whatever comes to him,
No. Death can have me when it earns me.
it's his own actions that push Atreus away. He doesn't apply that same trust to him. Thankfully, it's both of their understanding and trust in each other growing to a point that could lead them to work through it together. The grief and guilt they carry begins to fade away as they confide in each other. They stop fighting prophecy because ultimately it doesn't matter if what they do is written. They don't do it because they're told that they do it. They do it because they feel that it is right. To stop fighting prophecy is to break free from it, your actions unbound by it. Some people see visions. Those visions are not guaranteed to occur. The Norns see the threads of fate, but explain that there's no destiny. No one is forcing you to follow that path. But when it comes down to it, people largely act in line with their core beliefs and personality, so they are just able to seem prescient. So, essentially, fate is literally what you make it. Details can change, large and small, but they're typically in line with people's decisions, changing in large or small ways themselves. Kratos is a sad boy now, but he still makes the same choices. His feelings about those choices change in small or large ways, but his actions remain consistent, leading to a consistently tragic outcome. Meanwhile, Atreus becomes accustomed to grief early and often, losing his mom, Uncle Brock, and his dog Fenrir in the span of a few years. But through the support and love of the people close to him that he cares about and that care about his well-being, he learns to accept it and fight for the future that they sacrificed for. But in Ragnarok, the path that father and son have walked finally merges in a meaningful way. The compassionate worldview that Faye tried to impress upon Kratos finally breaks through, while the Spartan view of war and sacrifice that Kratos repeats breaks through to Atreus. But it's in this moment that Kratos makes the meaningful change needed to break free from the consistency of his actions, the cycle of vengeance, in seeing Atreus, who so often absorbs the counsel of those around him. He begins to close his heart to the world and its suffering. Kratos cannot ignore the death happening to his son in real time. If Atreus becomes him, if Atreus loses his heart, it would essentially mean his death. The very metaphorical yet equally impactful death of the compassionate boy we knew into, well, Kratos. It would mean that whether Kratos lived or died, only Loki would remain. And he would be a god willing to sacrifice the innocent for his perceived sense of vengeance and justice. But in accepting grief, here in this place of ultimate choice, they finish the job Faye started and smash the future bound to them. It's right here, when both of them have progressed to the point that they collectively agree to be better, to right their wrongs, to accept those we love and let them live their paths as they feel is right. We can wipe away the words that are written and write them ourselves, to create a new world. We can accept the dangers of grief and guilt through the knowledge that love is worth it, and if you open your heart to it, you will find every reason to keep living. Thanks for watching. Be safe.
you see in there, brother?
Path. One I had never imagined.
And what now?
There is much to do. Much to rebuild. Would you join me?
Aye.
We'll see to it.